Good evening, everyone. Today we are going to examine one of the most significant military operations to unfold in recent hours. The United States has launched what President Trump described as large-scale retaliatory strikes against ISIS positions in Syria. This operation, which unfolded just hours ago, represents a crucial moment in American foreign policy, counterterrorism strategy, and Middle Eastern geopolitics. Over the next 50 minutes, we will analyze the immediate context, explore multiple possible outcomes, assess the implications for regional stability, and consider what this means for American interests moving forward. Let me begin by laying out what actually happened. Last Saturday, December 13th, 2 Iowa National Guard soldiers and a civilian interpreter were killed in an attack near the ancient city of Palmyra in Syria. The victims were Sergeant Edgar Brian Torres Tovar, 25 years old from Des Moines, and Sergeant William Nathaniel Howard, 29 years old from Marshalltown. The civilian interpreter was Ayed Mansour Sakat from Michigan. 3 additional American soldiers were wounded in this attack. These Americans were conducting what the military calls a key leader engagement, essentially a meeting with local partners as part of ongoing counterterrorism operations. The attacker was identified as someone who had joined Syria's internal security forces just 2 months prior as a base security guard. Interestingly, and this is crucial to understanding the complexity of the situation, he had recently been reassigned because there were suspicions about his potential affiliation with ISIS. The gunman was killed during the attack, but the damage was done. 3 Americans were dead, 3 more were wounded, and the Trump administration immediately signaled that retaliation would be swift and severe. President Trump attended the dignified transfer ceremony at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware earlier this week, meeting privately with the families of the fallen before standing on the tarmac with military officials to honor these Americans. The symbolism was powerful. The message was clear. There would be consequences. And today, those consequences arrived. The United States launched what has been designated Operation Hawkeye Strike, named after Iowa, the Hawkeye State, home to both fallen soldiers. According to U.S. Central Command, American forces employed more than 100 precision munitions to strike over 70 targets across multiple locations in Syria. These strikes focused on ISIS infrastructure, weapons storage sites, and operational bases in areas including Deir, ez-Zor province in eastern Syria, Raqqa province, and the mountainous Jabal al-Amur region near Palmyra. The military assets involved tell us about the scale and seriousness of this operation. F-15 Eagle fighter jets, A-10 Thunderbolt ground attack aircraft, AH-64 Apache helicopters, HIMARS rocket artillery systems, and even Jordanian F-16 fighter jets participated in coordinated strikes. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was a comprehensive military operation designed to degrade ISIS capabilities in a significant way. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth characterized these strikes not as the beginning of a war, but as a declaration of vengeance. His statement was unambiguous. If you target Americans anywhere in the world, the United States will hunt you, find you, and kill you. President Trump echoed this sentiment in his social media posts, warning in capital letters that anyone who attacks or threatens the United States will be hit harder than they have ever been hit before. Now, before we move into predictions and analysis, we need to understand the broader context. Why are American troops in Syria in the first place? The answer goes back to 2014 and 2015 when ISIS rapidly seized control of vast territories across Syria and Iraq, establishing what they called a caliphate. The brutality was extraordinary. Mass executions, enslavement of religious minorities, destruction of ancient cultural heritage sites, and sophisticated propaganda that recruited fighters from around the world. The United States, working with a broad international coalition and local partners, launched Operation Inherent Resolve to combat this threat. Over several years, through a combination of airstrikes, special operations, and support for local forces like the Syrian Democratic Forces, the territorial caliphate was systematically dismantled. By 2019, ISIS had lost its last territorial stronghold. However, and this is critical, ISIS was defeated as a territorial entity but not as an organization or ideology. Today, approximately 1,000 American troops remain in Syria, primarily in the eastern part of the country. Their mission is to prevent ISIS from reconstituting itself, to support partner forces, and to maintain pressure on remaining ISIS cells. Between 100 and 150 of these troops are based at Tanf Garrison, a remote outpost on Syria's border with Jordan, which is where the Iowa National Guard soldiers were stationed. The security environment in Syria is extraordinarily complex. The fall of Bashar al-Assad's government in late 2024 created a new political reality. The current interim president, Ahmad al-Sharaa, who leads what is essentially a transitional government, has been working to improve relations with Western countries and has expressed commitment to combating ISIS. President Trump has met with al-Sharaa and has publicly stated that the Syrian government fully supports American strikes against ISIS. Syria's foreign ministry released a statement following today's strikes emphasizing their commitment to ensuring ISIS has no safe havens on Syrian territory. However, we must acknowledge the irony and complexity here. Ahmad al-Sharaa was himself designated as a terrorist by the United States Treasury Department until very recently, when he was removed from that list in advance of his meeting with President Trump. He is trying to transform his image and legitimize his government in the eyes of the international community. The fact that an attack on American forces happened while they were working alongside Syrian security forces puts additional pressure on this new government to demonstrate its capability and commitment to security. So with that foundation established, let us now turn to the predictive analysis. What are the possible outcomes of these strikes, and what should we be watching for in the coming days, weeks, and months? The first scenario we need to consider is successful deterrence and degradation of ISIS capabilities. This is obviously the outcome the Trump administration is hoping for and publicly projecting. In this scenario, the strikes accomplish several objectives simultaneously. They eliminate significant ISIS leadership, destroy weapons caches and operational infrastructure, disrupt planning for future attacks, and most importantly, send an unmistakable message to ISIS fighters and potential recruits that attacking Americans results in overwhelming retaliation. If this scenario unfolds as intended, we would expect to see a measurable decrease in ISIS attacks in the coming months. Intelligence gathered during the 10 operations conducted in the week following the initial attack, which resulted in approximately 23 ISIS fighters killed or detained, could prove crucial. Electronics and other materials seized during those operations reportedly provided targeting information that contributed to today's strikes. This intelligence-driven approach, if successful, means the strikes were hitting actual operational nodes rather than symbolic targets. We would also see increased cooperation between American forces, the Syrian government, and regional partners like Jordan. The fact that Jordanian aircraft participated in today's strikes is significant. Jordan has its own security concerns regarding ISIS, and coordinated operations suggest a level of regional consensus about the threat and the response. If this cooperation deepens and expands, it could create a more effective counter-terrorism architecture in the region. Success in this scenario would also reinforce the Trump administration's doctrine of peace through strength. The president has repeatedly emphasized that American willingness to use decisive force when threatened is itself a deterrent to future attacks. If ISIS activities measurably decrease, if other militant groups take notice and adjust their behavior, then the administration will claim validation of this approach. However, and we must be clear-eyed about this, there are significant challenges to achieving this ideal outcome. ISIS is not a conventional military that can be defeated through airstrikes alone. It is a decentralized network with cells spread across multiple countries. Strikes in Syria, no matter how precise, cannot eliminate ISIS ideology or the conditions that allow it to recruit new members. This brings us to the second major scenario, which is escalation and broader instability. Military retaliation, even when justified and targeted, can produce unintended consequences. ISIS has historically been adept at using civilian casualties, real or exaggerated, as propaganda to recruit new fighters. If today's strikes resulted in civilian deaths, even accidentally, ISIS will exploit those images and narratives to portray themselves as defenders of Muslims against American aggression. We need to monitor Syrian media, social media channels, and statements from local communities in the coming days. Claims of civilian casualties, whether accurate or fabricated, can inflame anti-American sentiment and create sympathy for ISIS among populations that might otherwise reject them. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which monitors the conflict, reported that at least 5 ISIS members were killed in Deir, ez-Zor province, including a leader of a drone cell. But comprehensive casualty figures are not yet available. There is also the question of ISIS response. Will they attempt retaliation? Do they have the capability to strike American interests again, either in Syria or elsewhere in the region. The fact that the initial attack was carried out by an infiltrator within Syrian security forces suggests that ISIS retains some capacity for sophisticated operations. If they can penetrate local security forces once, they may attempt it again. An escalatory spiral is possible. ISIS attacks, American retaliation, further ISIS attacks, further American responses. This pattern could draw the United States deeper into Syria at a time when the Trump administration has expressed desire to reduce American military commitments overseas. Approximately 1,800 Iowa National Guard soldiers are currently deployed to the Middle East as part of Operation Inherent Resolve. Their families are watching this situation with understandable anxiety. Will this deployment be extended? Will additional forces be required? Regional actors are also a factor in potential escalation. Iran has historically had significant influence in Syria and maintains military advisors and proxy forces there. While today's strikes apparently targeted only ISIS positions, any perception that American military activity in Syria is expanding could trigger responses from Iranian-backed groups. We have seen in recent years how proxy conflicts in Syria can rapidly become more complex, with multiple actors pursuing competing agendas. Russia also maintains a military presence in Syria and has been a key supporter of Syrian forces. While Russian and American forces have generally managed to deconflict their operations, increased American military activity could create friction or miscalculation risks. The last thing anyone wants is an accidental confrontation between American and Russian forces. The third major scenario we need to consider involves the domestic political implications and the broader question of American strategy in the Middle East. President Trump campaigned in part on a promise to end endless wars and bring American troops home. Yet here we are with significant military operations in Syria, ongoing deployments throughout the region, and rhetoric about hunting down enemies anywhere in the world. How does the American public respond to this? Initial reactions will likely be supportive. When Americans are killed, there is typically bipartisan support for retaliation. The dignified transfer at Dover Air Force Base, the personal involvement of the president, the emphasis on honoring fallen patriots, these all resonate deeply with American values and sentiment. But if the situation in Syria becomes more protracted, if American casualties continue, if the mission expands or extends indefinitely, public opinion could shift. We saw this pattern in Iraq and Afghanistan. Initial support erodes as wars drag on without clear endpoints or definitions of victory. The Trump administration will need to articulate clearly what success looks like in Syria and how they plan to achieve it. There is also the question of congressional authorization. Current American military operations in Syria are technically conducted under the 2001 authorization for use of military force passed after September 11. But that authorization is now nearly a quarter-century old and was designed for a different conflict against different adversaries. There have been ongoing debates in Congress about whether current operations exceed the scope of that authorization and whether new congressional approval is needed. Today's strikes were clearly framed as retaliation for a specific attack on American forces, which falls under the president's constitutional authority to defend American troops. But if operations expand significantly, if this becomes a sustained campaign rather than a targeted retaliation, questions about war powers and congressional oversight will intensify. From a strategic perspective, we need to ask what American objectives in Syria actually are at this point. The original mission was to defeat the ISIS territorial caliphate, and that was accomplished. The current mission is described as preventing ISIS from reconstituting. But how do you measure success in prevention? When can you declare that ISIS is sufficiently degraded that American troops can leave? These are not easy questions. The geopolitical dimension is crucial. Syria sits at a crossroads of regional and great power competition. Turkey has its own interests and has conducted operations against Kurdish forces that are American partners. Israel conducts strikes against Iranian positions in Syria. Russia seeks to maintain its Mediterranean naval base and its influence. Iran views Syria as a crucial link in its regional network. The new Syrian government is trying to establish legitimacy and rebuild a shattered country. American military presence in Syria, even when focused on ISIS, exists within this complex web of competing interests. Every action has ripple effects. Today's strikes, while directed at ISIS, send messages to all these other actors as well. They demonstrate American capability and willingness to act. They show support for the new Syrian government. They signal to regional partners that the United States remains engaged. But they also raise questions about American long-term intentions. Now let me address the fourth major consideration, which involves the effectiveness and limitations of counterterrorism strategies. Air strikes can destroy infrastructure and kill fighters, but they cannot address the underlying conditions that allow terrorist organizations to emerge and persist. ISIS arose in the context of state collapse, sectarian conflict, political oppression, economic devastation, and the failure of governance in Iraq and Syria. Those conditions have not fundamentally changed. Syria remains deeply damaged by more than a decade of civil war. Infrastructure is destroyed. Millions of people have been displaced. The economy is shattered. Sectarian and ethnic tensions persist. The new government, while expressing good intentions, faces enormous challenges in establishing effective control, providing services, and creating legitimate governance structures. In this environment, defeating ISIS militarily is necessary but not sufficient. Without effective governance, without economic opportunity, without reconciliation between communities, the space for extremism remains. ISIS or something like it can reconstitute as long as these conditions persist. This is the fundamental challenge of counterterrorism. You can kill leaders, you can destroy weapons, you can disrupt operations, but if you do not address root causes, the threat regenerates. The United States has limited ability and, frankly, limited appetite for the kind of long-term state building and reconstruction that would be required to truly stabilize Syria. The American people have made clear through multiple election cycles that they are skeptical of nation-building projects. The Trump administration has been particularly critical of what it views as endless commitments to rebuild other countries. So we face a dilemma. Maintaining a military presence sufficient to suppress ISIS requires ongoing commitment and resources. Withdrawing completely risks allowing ISIS to reconstitute and potentially plan attacks against American interests or allies. Neither option is ideal. This is what makes Syria such a challenging problem for American policymakers. The fifth area we need to examine is the intelligence and operational dimensions. Reports indicate that the strikes were informed by intelligence gathered in the immediate aftermath of the initial attack. This is significant. It suggests that American and partner forces were able to rapidly exploit the attack, identify networks and locations, and develop targeting packages. Modern counterterrorism operations are heavily dependent on intelligence. Signals intelligence, human intelligence, forensic analysis of captured materials, interrogation of detained fighters, all of these feed into an intelligence picture that guides operations. The speed with which Operation Hawkeye Strike was planned and executed suggests that there was already substantial intelligence on ISIS networks in Syria that could be updated and refined with new information. Central Command reported that one of today's strikes killed an ISIS leader named Abu Yusuf in Deir ez-Zor province. Killing leadership is a standard counterterrorism tactic, based on the theory that degrading leadership disrupts operations and demoralizes fighters. However, history shows that terrorist organizations often have succession plans. Killing one leader creates an opening for another to emerge. The question is whether the organization is being disrupted faster than it can regenerate. The use of over 100 precision munitions against more than 70 targets indicates a significant intelligence collection and targeting effort. Each of those targets had to be identified, assessed for military necessity, deconflicted to minimize civilian casualties, and assigned to appropriate weapon systems. This is complex work that requires substantial time and resources. One question for analysts will be how effective these strikes actually were. In the fog of war, initial reports are often incomplete or inaccurate. Battle damage assessment takes time. Did the strikes hit what they were intended to hit? Were the targets actually occupied or were they abandoned? How many ISIS fighters were actually killed? What percentage of ISIS capability in the region was degraded? These answers will emerge over time through intelligence reporting. Now let us consider the regional and international dimensions more deeply. Jordan's participation in today's strikes is noteworthy. Jordan has been a key American ally and has its own significant concerns about ISIS. The group has conducted attacks in Jordan, and the country hosts refugees from the Syrian conflict who could be vulnerable to radicalization. Jordanian cooperation in counter-terrorism operations benefits both countries and demonstrates regional solidarity against ISIS. However, we should note that other regional powers were apparently not involved or at least have not been publicly acknowledged as participants. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf states have their own relationships with various Syrian factions and their own concerns about ISIS. The configuration of who participates in operations like this reveals alignments and interests. Turkey presents a particularly complex case. Turkey is a NATO ally but has often been at odds with American policy in Syria, particularly regarding support for Kurdish forces. The Syrian Democratic Forces, which have been key American partners against ISIS, include significant Kurdish elements that Turkey views as linked to Kurdish separatist movements in Turkey itself. This creates ongoing tension. Turkey has conducted its own operations in northern Syria, sometimes targeting groups that America works with. The fall of Assad and the emergence of a new Syrian government adds another layer of complexity. Turkey has influence with some Syrian opposition groups and has its own vision for Syria's future. How Turkey responds to increased American military activity will be important to watch. On the international stage, responses from European allies, from Russia, from China, from other powers will be instructive. European countries have their own concerns about ISIS and about Syrian refugees. They generally support counter-terrorism efforts but may have concerns about military escalation or about American unilateralism. Russia, as I mentioned earlier, has been a key Assad supporter and maintains military presence in Syria. Russian reaction to American strikes has historically ranged from rhetorical criticism to practical deconfliction to ensure operations do not interfere with each other. In the current geopolitical climate, with tensions over Ukraine and other issues, how Russia responds will be a factor. China may use this as an opportunity to criticize American military interventionism, particularly if there are civilian casualties. China has been positioning itself as alternative to American global leadership and seizes on instances where American military action can be portrayed negatively. Let me now address some humanitarian and ethical considerations. Military operations in populated areas always carry risks of civilian casualties, no matter how precise the weapons or how careful the planning. Syria has suffered immensely over more than a decade of conflict. Civilian populations have endured bombardment from multiple sides, displacement, loss of homes and livelihoods, family members killed or missing. When the United States conducts strikes, even when those strikes are legitimately targeting terrorists, there is an ethical obligation to minimize harm to civilians. The Pentagon emphasizes that these were precision strikes against ISIS infrastructure and weapons sites in relatively remote areas. But we should acknowledge that civilian harm, if it occurs, has moral significance beyond just operational considerations. There is also the question of what happens to areas where ISIS presence is degraded. Who fills that vacuum? In the complex patchwork of control in Syria, clearing one group from an area does not automatically mean stabilization. Local dynamics, tribal relationships, resource competition, all of these continue to operate. The broader question of reconciliation in Syria is relevant here. Eventually, there needs to be some process by which communities that have been divided by war can coexist again. That requires not just military solutions but political reconciliation, justice mechanisms, economic reconstruction. None of those are simple, and American capacity to influence them is limited. As we move toward conclusions, let me synthesize what we should be watching for in the coming period. First, watch for ISIS response. Do they have the capability and will to conduct further attacks? Do they issue statements or propaganda that reveal their strategic thinking? Monitoring jihadist media channels and social media will be important. Second, watch casualty reports and damage assessments. Initial reports will be revised as more information becomes available. Independent monitoring organizations, local reports, satellite imagery analysis, all of these will contribute to a clearer picture of what actually happened on the ground. Third, watch for any shift in the security situation in Syria. Do ISIS attacks decrease? Do other actors change their behavior? Is there any spillover into neighboring countries? Security dynamics in a place like Syria are interconnected and fluid. Fourth, watch the political dimension in Washington. How does Congress respond? Are there calls for hearings or briefings? Do any lawmakers question the legal authorization or strategic wisdom of operations? What does public opinion polling show about American support for military action in Syria? Fifth, watch regional reactions. How do Syria's neighbors respond? What do regional media report? Are there diplomatic initiatives or changes in bilateral relationships? The regional context heavily influences what is possible in Syria. Sixth, watch for any indication of mission expansion. Does the number of American troops in Syria increase? Do operations expand beyond ISIS to target other groups? Is there any indication of shifting objectives? Mission creep is a persistent danger in military operations. Let me offer some predictions about likely outcomes. I expect that in the immediate term, ISIS activity in Syria will be somewhat disrupted by these strikes. The loss of infrastructure, weapons, and personnel creates operational challenges. However, I do not expect ISIS to be decisively defeated by this operation alone. They retain capacity to regenerate and adapt. I predict that the Trump administration will declare the operation a success and will point to it as evidence of their willingness to use decisive force to protect Americans. This will likely be well received domestically in the short term, particularly among those who prioritize strong military responses. I expect that American troops will remain in Syria for the foreseeable future, despite rhetoric about ending endless wars. The mission will continue to be described as preventing ISIS from reconstituting, and that mission does not have a clear endpoint. Periodic strikes like this may become a regular feature of American operations in the region. I predict that the new Syrian government will publicly support American actions while privately working to consolidate its own control and reduce dependence on foreign forces. Their interests align with American interests regarding ISIS, but they also want to establish sovereignty and legitimacy. I do not expect major escalation in the near term, but I believe the risk remains elevated. The complex dynamics in Syria mean that incidents like the initial attack could happen again, potentially triggering cycles of retaliation. In terms of strategic implications, this operation reinforces American commitment to counterterrorism but also highlights the challenges of achieving decisive results. Terrorism is not primarily a military problem, though military action is sometimes necessary. It is a political, economic, ideological problem that requires comprehensive approaches. The operation also demonstrates the continuing reality of American military engagement in the Middle East despite desires to focus elsewhere. Regardless of strategic preferences, events compel responses. American forces remain deployed in multiple countries across the region, and incidents like this one remind us that those deployments carry risks. For the families of the fallen soldiers and the wounded, this operation may provide some sense that their loved ones have been avenged. That emotional and psychological dimension matters. But no military operation can fully compensate for loss, and the question of whether the mission in Syria is worth the cost remains open. As we conclude, I want to emphasize several overarching points. First, the situation in Syria remains highly complex with no easy solutions. Second, counterterrorism requires sustained commitment and cannot be achieved through military force alone. Third, every military operation has strategic, political, ethical, and human dimensions that must be considered together. Fourth, the outcomes of today's strikes will unfold over time and will depend on many factors beyond the strikes themselves. The United States faces difficult choices about its role in Syria and the broader Middle East. There are legitimate arguments for maintaining pressure on ISIS and supporting partners. There are also legitimate arguments about the limits of what military force can achieve and about opportunity costs of commitments in one region versus another. What we can say with confidence is that ISIS remains a threat, that the attack on American forces was tragic and required response, that today's operation represents a significant military effort, and that the situation will continue to evolve in ways that are difficult to predict with certainty. The ultimate question is whether American policy in Syria, of which this operation is one part, advances American interests and contributes to regional stability in a sustainable way. That question cannot be answered by one operation or one analysis. It requires ongoing assessment, adjustment, and difficult decisions about resources, risks, and priorities. Thank you for your attention to this detailed examination. The situation in Syria matters, not just because Americans are deployed there, not just because ISIS remains a threat, but because it illustrates the enduring challenges of security in an interconnected world where conflicts in distant places can have direct implications for American interests and American lives.